Every day, it feels like there's another headline about generative AI. It's outsmarting exams, writing screenplays, sometimes even passing for human in a chat.
Oh, absolutely. The hype is just incredible. And honestly, for good reason.
It is. But beneath all that really dazzling innovation, there's this quieter problem, maybe more insidious, that often gets overshadowed:
Right. Yeah.
algorithmic bias.
Yeah.
And this isn't just about AI getting a fact wrong, it's more like an invisible skew.
Yeah.
It creeps into how a model behaves,
Hmm.
affecting everything from, say, loan approvals to these weird stereotypes popping up in search results.
Exactly. And within that whole area, what we're really diving into today is something specific: cultural bias.
Okay.
And it's a particularly, well, tricky because it subtly shapes what an AI praises or mocks or recommends. And when it does that, it starts to shape us too.
How so?
Well, imagine talking to a model in Urdu. You get one kind of answer.
Hmm.
Then you switch to English, and suddenly it sounds, well, curiously different. For years, a lot of researchers kind of shrugged this off, said it was, just data noise, random fluctuations.
Right, just statistical anomalies.
But now, some really groundbreaking research has pulled back the curtain. It shows these aren't random drifts at all. They're systematic patterns.
Systematic.
Yeah, large language models, LLMs, they're actually biasing entire conversations towards the cultural values embedded deep inside their training data.
Wow. And people using them probably don't even notice.
Rarely, but their worldviews might shift, just, by degrees, almost invisibly.
And that's exactly why we wanted to do this deep dive. Our mission today is really to unpack this landmark study. It's called Cultural Tendencies in Generative AI.
Hmm.
It basically cracked open GPT-4's cultural core. We're going to look at that, compare it with Baidu's Ernie model, and then hopefully lay out a roadmap for how you, listening, can think about measuring algorithmic bias in practice.
Yeah, it's crucial stuff.
Definitely. If you care about trustworthy AI, I think you're going to find this really fascinating. So when we talk about algorithmic bias, it's probably worth saying it's not just one single thing.
Right. No, definitely not. It comes in different flavors.
Like you've got statistical bias, representational bias, and then this one we're focusing on cultural bias.
Exactly.
Maybe quickly frame those first two. Statistical bias is when an algorithm hits one demographic harder, like maybe unfairly denying loans to a certain group.
Precisely. And representational bias is more about, say, erasing minority voices or just, misrepresenting whole communities in the AI's output.
Got it.
And these cultural drifts, as we're calling them, they're different again. They're where the system subtly starts to rewrite social norms.
Rewrite norms. That sounds pretty significant.
It is. Think about it. These biases can creep into the nuanced phrasing in policy briefs or the tone of a mental health chatbot. Even, maybe, how a robot vacuum navigates a room, reflecting different cultural ideas about space or obstacles.
Okay, let's try and make that concrete. You gave an example earlier. Could you walk us through that?
Sure. Imagine two different users ask the same AI, should I prioritize my personal goals over group harmony?
Okay.
Now, a culturally skewed system, it might tell the English speaker, yeah, chase your independence, focus on your ambition.
Right. The sort of individualistic angle.
Exactly. But
Mhm.
then it might turn around and tell the Mandarin speaker, no, keep the peace, prioritize the group's harmony.
Wow, that's quite a divergence from the same basic question.
It really is. And it might seem subtle, but that's a super powerful example of this kind of algorithmic bias. Think about the downstream impact.
Yeah, what happens next?
Well, every content filter, every classroom assistant, every legal summary tool that uses that AI core, it inherits that same tilt.
So it just propagates outwards. Makes you wonder if my robot vacuum would be less aggressive if it had, like, different cultural training. Maybe it wouldn't try to trip me so often.
Huh? Maybe. But what's really fascinating and challenging is that measuring this cultural bias is, well, it's a lot messier than just counting errors like in image recognition.
How so?
You need pretty sophisticated psychological scales. You need really careful prompt design, and you need large samples to actually see the signal through all the noise.
So it's harder to pin down.
Much harder.
Yeah.
And that difficulty, for a long time, it kept this conversation kind of academic,
Yeah,
theoretical.
but not anymore.
Not anymore. As we'll see, that challenge has been met.
Okay, so if it's that tricky to measure, how do you start to quantify something as, well, elusive as cultural bias in an AI?
Yeah, great question.
That leads us to this paper you mentioned, Cultural Tendencies in Generative AI. You said it's a landmark study.
I really think it is. It sets a new standard, moving the conversation from just theory to, actual actionable insights.
So how did they set it up? What was the experiment like?
Meticulous is the word. It was like a scientific expedition digging into the AI's mind. They tested two main models, OpenAI's GPT-4, the 1106 preview version, and Baidu's Ernie, the 3.58K model.
Right, the big players.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they focused on two languages, English and Chinese. They ran a lot of tests, 100 iterations for each language, for each measure they were looking at.
100 times.
Yeah. And then they replicated the prompt, runs 200 times per language, just to be absolutely sure the results weren't some kind of fluke.
Okay, that sounds thorough.
And, crucially, they locked the temperature setting.
Ah, the randomness control.
Right. They set it to 0, which makes the AI very deterministic, very repeatable. Then they double-checked everything with a higher temperature setting just to see if the findings still held up when the AI had a bit more, let's say, creative freedom.
Smart. And what were they actually looking for? Not just surface stuff, you said.
No, they went deep into cultural psychology concepts. Two main ones. First, social orientation. Basically, does the AI lean towards being interdependent group-focused or independent self-focused? And second, cognitive style. Is it holistic, seeing things in context, relationship-focused, or analytic focusing on individual objects and rules?
And these aren't just abstract ideas.
Not at all. These deep traits affect everything from how, say, someone might resolve an argument to how they judge probabilities in everyday life.
So how did they measure these deep traits in an AI?
They used a really clever mix of methods. Standard Lakert scales, they strongly agree to strongly disagree questions.
Right.
They also use vignette reasoning tasks. They'd give the AI these short, carefully designed scenarios with no cultural cues and ask for its judgment.
Interesting.
And even in imagery prompts, something called the inclusion of other in self-diagram,
Yeah.
and a visual way to gauge feelings of connection to others.
Wow. Okay.
But here's the absolutely critical part. Every single prompt was given in both English and Chinese, but with zero cultural hints added by the researchers. None at all. Meaning any differences they saw in the AI's answers had to come from the model's own internal values, things it picked up during training, not from the way the question was asked.
That methodology itself sounds really important, like a template for others.
Exactly. It's not just academic. It's a practical blueprint for any organization that's serious about measuring bias in their own AI.
So what are the key steps people should take away from that?
Use validated psychological tools. Be incredibly careful with translation back-translate to make sure the wording itself isn't introducing bias. Randomize the order of your prompts. Lock down variables like temperature, only changing the language.
Makes sense.
And something really worth celebrating about this study. The authors were totally transparent. They shared their analysis code, all their raw data.
That's huge.
It really is.
Yeah.
Every AI fairness audit should aim for that level of openness. It's how we all learn and get better faster.
Okay, the moment of truth then. After all that careful setup, what did they actually find? What was the core result?
The core finding was pretty stark. Across every single metric they used, GPT-4, when it was interacting in Chinese, behaved much more like an interdependent, holistic mind.
Every metric.
Every single one. And this wasn't like a tiny blip or a rounding error. This was algorithmic bias showing up at a really deep cultural level.
Can you give us some examples to make that clearer? Like, how big was the difference?
Sure. Take the collectivism scale. They found a 0.47 difference on a 7-point scale.
Sure.
Now, that might not sound huge, but in psychometrics, that translates to a medium to large effect size. Meaning ChatGPT, when spoken to in Chinese, was significantly more likely to embrace group loyalty and collective thinking compared to when it spoke English. It's like it genuinely shifted its values.
Wow.
The inclusion of other in self-task showed an even bigger effect, a large effect size, pointing strongly towards more interdependence in Chinese.
And the reasoning task.
That's really telling.
Yeah.
The Chinese version of GPT-4 rejected formal logic in favor of just kind of gut plausibility nearly 3 times as often as the English version did.
3 times.
Yeah. It showed the model had genuinely internalized these culturally grounded ways of thinking, these mental shortcuts or heuristics, just from the language data. No one told it to do that.
And they saw this in the text answers, too.
Yep, they looked at things like context sensitivity in the free text answers. The range of factors considered more evidence of that holistic thinking style coming through in Chinese.
Okay, so GPT-4 definitely shows these cultural leanings based on language. The big question then is, was this just an OpenAI thing? What about Baidu's model, Ernie?
Right, that's the crucial comparison. And fascinatingly, Ernie showed the mirror image.
The mirror image.
Exactly. It was more interdependent and holistic in Chinese and less so in English. Just like GPT-4, but obviously reflecting its own training data.
And were the effects similar in size?
Remarkably so. The effect sizes for Ernie changing behavior between languages. They matched GPT-4's almost perfectly, well within the statistical confidence bands.
That symmetry, what does that imply?
It strongly suggests there's some kind of universal mechanism at play here in LLMs. It seems like these models absorb cultural vectors, patterns of association, really that are just lurking within the language co-occurrence patterns in their massive training data sets.
So you change the language?
You change the cultural vector field the AI is operating in. It activates different sets of associations and values.
That's a huge takeaway because it kind of blows up the idea that these models just have a default Western or Anglo-centric bias.
Exactly. It shows GPT isn't inherently Anglo-centric, it's context-centric.
Yeah.
And in this case, the most powerful context is language, which, as this study demonstrates, carries a deep shadow of culture with it.
Can you give us a practical example of how this played out? The study mentioned marketing.
Yeah, they did this neat little toy marketing scenario. They asked GPT-4 to choose between slogans that had either an independent or a collectivist framing.
Okay, like what?
In English, the model preferred a slogan like, "Your future, your peace of mind." Very individual focus.
Right.
But when they switched the interaction to Chinese, it consistently picked "your family's future, your promise." Much more group-oriented.
And was his preference strong?
Overwhelmingly strong. The statistics they ran, chi-square tests, had scores over 89. That basically screams statistical significance. It means there's almost zero chance this was random. It's a real embedded pattern.
That has massive implications, doesn't it? Think about a multinational company using GPT for localizing ads or website copy.
Precisely. They could, completely unintentionally, end up serving these culturally tuned messages that just reinforce existing social norms in each market.
Which might be good for clicks, maybe, but it's actively propagating bias across borders.
Exactly. And it's not just marketing, right? Think about AI giving health advice or political messaging or educational content. The AI, trying to be locally relevant, might just double down on existing cultural divides without anyone instructing it to.
So the obvious next question is, can we fix this? Can we somehow neutralize this cultural drift?
Well, the research team tried something interesting. They gave the English version of GPT-4 a specific instruction, a prompt.
Oh, good, they tell it.
Something simple. You are an average person born and living in China. They basically gave it an explicit cultural lens to adopt.
And what happened?
It worked, to an extent. The English GPT started to mimic its Chinese profile. It became measurably more interdependent, more holistic in its responses.
So prompt engineering can make a difference?
It can nudge the values, yes. But, and this is a big but, it doesn't seem to erase the underlying bias baked into the model from its training data.
So it's not a fundamental fix.
Right. Which means you can run into ethical problems in two ways now. Either the unprompted, sort of hidden bias does its thing, or you try to correct it with a prompt and maybe overcorrect, or introduce new, different biases.
It sounds like prompt tweaks are just...
They're band-aids, not cures, as the researchers put it.
Right.
Real structural debiasing needs to happen much earlier, during data curation, during fine-tuning, not just slapped on at the end when a user types a question.
Okay, so if band-aids aren't enough, we need something more systemic. You mentioned an idea like an algorithmic bias ranking, an ABR framework.
Yeah, this is more of a vision maybe for regulators or industry bodies. Think of it like ESG ratings for environmental, social, and governance factors.
How would it work for AI bias?
Imagine running a standardized set of these psychometric prompts, the ones used in the study, maybe others too, across all the major AI models. GPT, Claude, Ernie, Gemini, the lot.
Okay.
Then you measure their cultural deviations, rank them, and publish the results. League tables for bias.
Wow, like dashboards showing GPT-5 has an ABR score of, say, 42, DeepSeek is 38, Claude is 55.
Exactly. It turns this abstract debate about fairness into something quantifiable, a KPI that companies have to track and improve.
That definitely raises the stakes. Public shaming is a powerful motivator.
It can be uncomfortable, for sure. But transparency is often what kicks off real progress and accountability.
Well, true. So for an organization listening now, wanting to tackle this within their own AI systems, what's the practical blueprint based on this study?
Okay, it boils down to a few key steps. First, define the stake. What are you using the AI for where cultural bias could matter? Advice, medical triage, finance.
Step 1, know the risk area.
Right. Second, select validated instruments.
Hmm.
Don't invent your own bias tests from scratch. Use tools from psychology like collectivism scales or attribution tasks that are known to be reliable.
Okay,
Third, translate with extreme care. Use back translation, maybe multiple translators, to ensure the meaning is identical across languages, not just the literal words.
crucial.
Fourth, run multi-language iterations.
Sure.
At least 100 runs per language per condition, like the study did, to get statistically solid results.
Fifth.
Lock randomness. Test at temperature 0, first for clear replication. Then maybe raise the temperature to stress test the model and see if the bias persists under more variable conditions.
Okay, control the variables.
Sixth, analyze both numbers and text. Don't just look at average scores on scales. Read the free text answers. Context matters. Nuance matters. Seventh, benchmark. Compare your model against others. Is your bias profile typical or an outlier? And finally, eighth, iterate. This isn't a one-off check. Use the results to guide debiasing efforts, maybe adjusting training data, then rerun the test to see if you've improved.
That's a really clear, actionable list. Thanks.
And of course, this study focused on English and Chinese, but those are just the beginning.
Right, the next frontiers.
Exactly. We desperately need to map bias in languages like Arabic, Spanish, Hindi, Swahili, hundreds more. Each language likely holds different cultural assumptions, different biases,
Disposing new layers.
and potentially uncovering different localized ways to fix them. You can even imagine parallel projects looking at things like gendered writing styles embedded in the models or regional dialects carrying specific biases. It's a huge landscape.
And presumably you can't just test once. Models get updated all the time.
Absolutely. That points to the need for longitudinal audits. Think of them like unit tests for values.
Unit tests for values, I like that.
You need to continuously monitor these cultural gradients to catch them shifting as new training data comes in. What seems fair today might drift tomorrow.
Is there a risk of things getting worse over time, like a feedback loop?
Oh, definitely. That's the danger of what some call self-reinforcing loops.
How does that work?
Okay, picture this. The AI model influences user behavior with its slightly biased output. That user behavior then generates new data-text interactions choices.
Which then gets used to train the next model.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the bias gets amplified. You could end up in these cultural echo chambers. Maybe English users get nudged towards more individualism, Mandarin speakers towards more collectivism, because the AI keeps subtly reinforcing those tendencies generation after generation.
It's quite a scary prospect. How do you stop that?
Active monitoring is key. And you might need to deliberately inject counterbalancing examples into future training data sets to prevent these runaway loops.
Okay, so bring it down to the builders, the developers, the product managers listening now. What are the immediate actions they should be taking?
All right, practical steps. 1, audit your prompts. Look for unintended cultural assumptions baked into the instructions you give your AI.
2.
Log the language context. When you record AI outputs, also record the language it was generated in. This helps trace bias later.
3.
Include cross-cultural test suites in your CI/CD pipelines. Make bias testing a routine part of development, just like performance testing.
Good one. 4.
Collaborate with social scientists. Don't try to interpret these complex cultural metrics alone. Bring in experts who understand the psychology.
What's 5?
Publish bias cards. Be transparent with every model release. Document the known limitations, including cultural biases you've measured.
Seems like investing in these steps up front could save a lot of trouble down the line.
Honestly, it costs a lot less than dealing with a major public relations crisis after your chatbot says something culturally clueless or offensive.
A very good point. So let's try and wrap this up. We started with this idea of AI hype versus the quieter problem of bias. And this study really brings home that central metaphor you used earlier, the AI as a kind of funhouse mirror.
Yeah, it stretches or shrinks our cultural traits depending on the language we use to look into it. It shows us a reflection, but it's not always a neutral one.
And the core finding is that this algorithmic bias goes way beyond just demographics, right? It gets into shared values, cognitive styles.
Absolutely. The Liu et al. Study proves it reaches right into our shared values. And if we ignore that, we genuinely risk creating these sort of asymmetric realities.
One reality for English speakers, another for Mandarin speakers.
One for each language, potentially one for each culture, subtly guiding people down different paths without them even knowing.
So the big takeaway here seems unavoidable. Dealing with algorithmic bias, especially this cultural kind, it's not just a nice to have anymore.
Not at all. It's a fundamental design requirement for AI. It's got to be right up there with performance, security, accuracy.
It needs to be baked in from the start.
Exactly. We need cross-cultural audits in every development sprint. We need open reporting standards. And we need to educate users, help them understand the hidden levers working behind these seemingly neutral AI assistants.
That feels like the path forward, making AI not just a cultural echo, but maybe something genuinely universal and trustworthy.
That has to be the goal.
Because really, at the end of the day, even the smartest machine we can build still just inherits our worldview, doesn't it?
It does.
So the question we leave you, our listener, with is this. Are we going to leave that inheritance completely unchecked? Something to think about.